The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of Manhattan's elite died in an instant. The silence that swept through the private dining room wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. At the head of the table sat Don Salvatore, a man whose name was whispered with dread from Palermo to New York, his fork hovering inches from his plate. His ruthless son, Leonardo, froze mid-sentence, his hand instinctively dropping toward his tailored jacket, and standing there, clutching a silver serving tray with trembling fingers, was Clara, a painfully shy 22-year-old waitress making minimum wage. She had just spoken 6 words. 6 words in a dead, archaic Sicilian dialect that no American should know, let alone a timid girl pouring wine. And in that frozen, terrifying second, Clara realized she hadn't just greeted a Mafia boss, she had accidentally revealed a ghost from his past. If you wanted to disappear in New York City, you didn't hide in the shadows. You stood in plain sight wearing a pressed white uniform and a black apron. Clara knew this better than anyone. At L'Eclipse, an obscenely exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant nestled in the affluent heart of Tribeca, waitstaff were trained to be phantoms. They poured $1,000 bottles of Barolo without making a sound, cleared plates like passing breezes, and absorbed the secrets of politicians, celebrities, and billionaires without ever changing their facial expressions. Clara was the best phantom they had. She was 22, with dark, observant eyes and a demeanor so timid that the aggressive kitchen staff barely noticed her. She never gossiped in the break room. She never complained about the grueling 14-hour shifts. To the rest of the staff, she was just Clara, the quiet girl from Queens who took the subway home at 3 a.m. and always covered everyone else's shifts. But Clara was hiding in plain sight. She wasn't just a girl from Queens. She was the granddaughter of Caterina Morabito, a woman who had fled the blood-soaked streets of Castellammare del Golfo in the late 1980s. Caterina hadn't just taught Clara how to make a proper ragu. She had raised her entirely in the old tongue, not standard Italian, not even modern Sicilian. Clara grew up speaking a localized ancient dialect of the Trapani province, a language heavy with honorifics, unspoken rules, and words that carried the weight of blood feuds. When her grandmother passed away, Clara locked that part of herself away. The dialect belonged to a dangerous world, a world her grandmother had crossed an ocean to escape. But L'Eclipse was about to become the epicenter of that exact world. For 3 weeks, the restaurant had been buzzing with a nervous, electric energy. Chef Gabriel, a notoriously hot-headed culinary genius, was sweating through his chef's coats. The private dining room, an opulent, soundproofed vault in the back, nicknamed the Cellar, had been booked out completely for a single Tuesday night. The reservation was under a corporate shell company, but the real names had leaked through the maitre d'. The Rossi family. Specifically, Leonardo Rossi. At 32, Leonardo was the undisputed heir to a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar empire that blurred the lines between legitimate high-rise real estate and ruthless old-school racketeering. He was cold, calculated, and fiercely modern. He wore Brioni suits, spoke unaccented English, and kept his hands ostensibly clean. But Leonardo wasn't the reason the maitre d' was popping antacids like candy. Leonardo was hosting a welcome dinner for his father. Don Salvatore Rossi was stepping onto American soil for the first time in over 20 years. He was an old-world boss, a relic of the fierce Sicilian Mafia wars of the 90s. The FBI had thousands of pages on him, yet no one had ever pinned a single charge on the man. Rumor had it that Don Salvatore despised America. He despised the modernization of his family's business. He despised the weakness of the new generation, and most of all, he despised disrespect. If any of you look him in the eye, I will personally throw you into the Hudson, Thomas, the head waiter, hissed at the staff during the pre-shift meeting. His face was pale. You serve from the left, clear from the right, and you do not speak unless spoken to. Actually, no. Even if they speak to you, just nod. These aren't Wall Street bros. These are the wolves of Palermo. Clara stood in the back row, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, hoping she wouldn't be assigned anywhere near the cellar. She just wanted to serve her tables, collect her tips, and go home to a tiny apartment. Fate, however, has a cruel sense of humor. By 8 p.m. the atmosphere inside L'Eclipse had shifted from high-end dining to a military occupation. 4 massive, stone-faced men in tailored suits took up positions near the restaurant's entrances. They didn't eat, they just watched. The regular patrons in the main dining area seemed to sense the shift in the air, speaking in hushed tones, completely unaware that a titan of the global underworld was walking through the heavily guarded back entrance. Clara was stationed in the main dining room, refilling water glasses, when she caught her first glimpse of Leonardo Rossi. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp aristocratic features and eyes like shattered ice. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator who owned the jungle. But it was the man walking beside him who made the air drop 10 degrees. Don Salvatore was a man carved from old mahogany and iron. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but his presence was suffocating. He wore a traditional dark suit with a silk ascot, his silver hair slicked back, a heavy gold signet ring resting on his weathered hand. He walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a custom-made silver-tipped cane, a souvenir, Whisper said, from a brutal assassination attempt in 1992. As they entered the cellar, the heavy oak doors shut, sealing them inside with their inner circle of capos and advisors. The panic in the kitchen spiked immediately. Chef Gabriel was screaming out orders in rapid-fire French, plating course after course of white truffle risotto and wagyu beef. Thomas, the head waiter, was assigned exclusively to the Rossi table. He was sweating profusely, his hands visibly shaking as he carried a tray of vintage 1982 Chateau Margaux towards the private room. Clara kept her head down, polishing silverware near the service station. She was safe out here. Or so she thought. At 9:15 p.m., disaster struck. Thomas burst through the kitchen doors, his face completely devoid of color. He was hyperventilating, clutching his right wrist. "I can't go back in there," Thomas gasped, leaning against the stainless steel prep counter. "I can't do it." Chef Gabriel rounded on him, brandishing a pair of culinary tongs. "What do you mean you can't go back in there? You haven't even served the main course." "The old man, the Don," Thomas stammered, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "I went to pour the wine. My hand shook. A single drop, just one drop, hit the tablecloth near his plate. He didn't yell. He just stopped talking, looked at the drop of wine, and then looked at me. His eyes. Chef, his eyes." One of the guys at the table casually unbuttoned his jacket. "I am not going back in there. Fire me. I don't care." Chef Gabriel turned purple. The food was dying on the pass. A table of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard was sitting in silence, waiting for their next course, and the head waiter had just suffered a full mental collapse. Gabriel's frantic eyes scanned the kitchen, landing on the waitstaff huddled in the corner. They all physically took a step back. Except for Clara. She was backed against the wall, trapped by a stack of bus tubs. "Clara," Chef Gabriel barked. "You, get an apron. You're taking the main courses in." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Chef, please, I'm just a junior. I don't care if you're the dishwasher," Gabriel roared, shoving a heavy silver tray loaded with 4 plates of steaming wagyu into her hands. "You are quiet. You are practically invisible. Go in there, put the food down without making a sound, and get out before they decide to buy this restaurant just to bulldoze it with us inside." Her hands trembling, Clara gripped the edges of the tray. She took a deep breath, trying to channel her grandmother's stoicism. Invisible, she reminded herself. Just be a ghost. She walked down the dimly lit hallway toward the cellar. The 2 massive bodyguards flanking the oak doors looked her up and down, their eyes cold and analytical, before stepping aside to push the heavy doors open. Clara stepped into the lion's den. The air inside the cellar was thick with the smell of expensive cigars, rich wine, and raw, unfiltered power. There were 8 men at the table. Leonardo Rossi sat to the right of his father. Don Salvatore sat at the head. They were speaking in low, rapid Italian, discussing union contracts and dock shipments. Leonardo was trying to explain the logistics of a new legitimate shipping front in Brooklyn, but Don Salvatore looked profoundly unimpressed. The old man's face was set in a deep scowl. He tapped his thick fingers against the table, a rhythmic, impatient sound. Clara approached the table like a shadow. She remembered Thomas's rule: serve from the left, clear from the right. Do not make eye contact. She moved with absolute precision. She slid the first plate in front of a heavily scarred capo, then moved to Leonardo. As she reached him, Leonardo paused his conversation, glancing up at her. He didn't see a person. He saw a uniform. He casually shifted his crystal water glass to give her room, his gaze returning immediately to his father. Gli americani non hanno rispetto per il tempo. Americans have no respect for time, Don Salvatore rasped in heavy, gravelly Italian. His voice commanded the room. Everyone stopped eating. They rush everything. The food, the business, the blood. They build empires on sand. Leonardo stiffened. Papa, the market here moves faster. We adapt, or we lose territory to the Russians. You adapt, the Don spat back, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, terrifying anger. You wear their suits, you speak their language, you employ these phantasmi. He gestured vaguely toward Clara, who was now approaching his left side to serve his plate. Ghosts. Servants who have no face, no culture, no respect. They don't know who they serve. In Palermo, a meal is an act of respect. Here, I am served by trembling machines. Clara's hands tightened on the silver tray. She lowered the plate of Wagyu to the table, her knuckles white. Don Salvatore didn't even look at the food. He looked at Clara's hands. He saw the slight tremble. Look at her! Don Salvatore sneered to his men, though he spoke in standard Italian, assuming Clara couldn't understand a word. She shakes like a rabbit. This is the respect my son buys in America. A frightened rabbit to feed the wolves. The men at the table chuckled darkly. Leonardo pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly embarrassed by the scene his father was making over a waitress. Papa, please, let the girl do her job. In my day, a guest of my stature was greeted with honor, the Don grumbled, staring at the perfect cut of meat with disdain, with words of weight, not this silent, trembling American fear. Clara froze. She wasn't a machine. She wasn't a rabbit. And suddenly, a surge of protective pride flared in her chest, not for herself, but for her grandmother. Nonna Caterina had scrubbed floors until her knees bled so that her family wouldn't have to bow to men like this in fear. Her grandmother had taught her that respect was earned, not demanded by terror. Clara finished placing the plate. According to every rule in the hospitality handbook, she was supposed to turn and walk away. Instead, Clara straightened her back. The trembling in her hands completely vanished. She stepped back from the table, locked her dark eyes squarely onto Don Salvatore's terrifying gaze, and crossed her hands over her apron. The room grew instantly quiet as the waitstaff's golden rule, never make eye contact, was shattered. Leonardo's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. One of the capos slowly lowered his fork. Clara ignored them all. She looked only at the Don. She didn't speak in standard Italian. She bypassed modern Sicilian entirely. She dug deep into the bedrock of her memory, pulling up a phrase of greeting so old, so steeped in the bloody, honor-bound history of the Trapanese Mountains, that it hadn't been spoken openly in decades. It was a greeting reserved exclusively for a Don, a phrase demanding absolute mutual respect, acknowledging power, but refusing subservience. Sabinerica Voskenza, Clara's voice rang out. It wasn't shy. It was loud, clear, and perfectly accented. Ci la pace e la salute ponnu accompagnare i vostri giorna, e ci lu sangue dei vostri nemici, un vi sporci mai la tavola. Blessings to your excellency. May peace and health accompany your days, and may the blood of your enemies never stain your table. For 3 seconds, the silence in the cellar was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a bomb detonating. The capo to Leonardo's right dropped his heavy silver knife. It clattered against the china with a deafening clink. Leonardo himself stared at Clara, his jaw tight, his sharp mind struggling to process how this timid girl in a cheap uniform had just perfectly executed a high Mafia honorific from the 1970s. But it was Don Salvatore's reaction that made the room's blood run cold. The old man's face, previously an unreadable mask of disdain, went completely pale. His hand, resting near his wine glass, slowly curled into a fist. He stared at Clara, his dark eyes wide, searching her face as if looking at a ghost that had just crawled out of a Castellamare grave. The phrase she used wasn't just old, it was specific. It was the exact greeting used by the allied families of his youth, families that had been wiped out in the turf wars. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Don Salvatore pushed his chair back. The heavy wood scraped against the floor. He stood up, leaning his weight onto his silver-tipped cane. The bodyguards at the door immediately reached inside their jackets. Don Salvatore took a single step toward Clara, towering over her. The scent of cigar smoke and expensive cologne was overwhelming. "Ci ti l'insegno cisto." "Who taught you this?" he whispered. His voice was no longer a gravelly roar. It was a deadly, quiet hiss. "Who are your people, girl?" The silence in the cellar stretched so taut, it felt as though the crystal chandeliers might shatter from the tension. The heavily scarred capo at the end of the table hadn't moved to pick up his dropped knife. The bodyguards flanking the oak doors remained perfectly still, their hands resting ominously inside their tailored jackets. Don Salvatore's breath was a ragged, shallow rasp. He stood inches from Clara, his silver-tipped cane trembling slightly under his weight. The scent of his spicy cedar-wood cologne was overpowering, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that Clara was desperately trying to suppress. "I asked you a question, girl," Don Salvatore repeated, his voice dropping an octave. He switched back to English, though his accent was thick and jagged. "Where did you learn those words? Who taught you to speak with the tongue of ghosts?" Clara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Hide the words, Clara. The words are blood." She had broken the one cardinal rule Caterina had given her on her deathbed. Pride had overriding logic, and now, standing before the apex predator of the Sicilian underworld, she was paying the price. My grandmother, sir," Clara lied, her voice dropping back to the timid, breathless whisper of a minimum-wage waitress. She cast her eyes downward, frantically trying to rebuild the facade of the invisible servant. "She was from Sicily. She taught me a few phrases to be polite. I apologize if I offended you, Voscenza." "Voscenza, Your Excellency." She had done it again. It was a reflex, deeply ingrained from childhood scoldings whenever she failed to show proper respect to her elders. Don Salvatore's eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. He reached out with his free hand, a hand adorned with a heavy gold signet ring bearing the Rossi family crest, and violently gripped Clara's chin, forcing her to look up at him. His grip was like a vice, shocking in its strength for a man of his age. "Do not lie to me," the old Don hissed, his gaze tracing the sharp line of her jaw, the deep dark brown of her eyes, and the slight defiant arch of her brows. "A grandmother teaches a child to say grazie and prego. She does not teach a child the blood greetings of the Castellamare High Council. She does not teach a child the dialect of the Trapani Mountains, unless that child was born to carry it." Clara swallowed hard, the sharp edge of the Don's ring pressing into her jawbone. "I am just a waitress, sir. My name is Clara Russo. Please let me go." "Russo," Salvatore scoffed, releasing her chin with a look of profound disgust. He wiped his hand on his silk handkerchief, as if touching a liar physically soiled him, a common name for a common coward. "You have the eyes of a Morabito, defiant arrogant, and stupid. At the mention of her true family name, Clara's blood turned to ice. She physically stumbled back a step, bumping into the serving tray. The silver clattered loudly, breaking the room's spell. Before Don Salvatore could advance again, Leonardo stood up. Leonardo Rossi moved with a liquid, predatory grace that commanded the room in a completely different way than his father's brute force. He didn't yell. He didn't brandish a weapon. He simply placed his heavy linen napkin on the table and stepped between Clara and the Don. "Papa, enough," Leonardo said. His voice smooth, cold, and utterly authoritative. "You are terrifying the staff, and the Wagyu is getting cold. We have a multi-million-dollar port contract to discuss with Vincent and Albert, and we are wasting time on a waitress who watched The Godfather too many times." Leonardo turned his back to his father, a deliberate and shocking show of dominance in front of the capos, and looked down at Clara. Up close, Leonardo's eyes were even more unsettling. They were a pale, striking blue, devoid of any warmth. He looked at Clara, not with the furious recognition of his father, but with a cold, intense curiosity. He saw the way she had flinched at the name Morabito. He noted the way her breathing had hitched. Leonardo was a man who traded in leverage and secrets, and he had just found a massive one standing in his private dining room. "Get out," Leonardo told her softly, his voice meant only for her ears. "Go back to the kitchen. Do not speak to anyone. Do not leave this building until I say so. Do you understand?" Clara nodded frantically, her throat too dry to form words. She grabbed the empty silver tray, spun on her heel, and practically sprinted out of the cellar. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, she heard Don Salvatore's furious voice roar, "You fool! You don't know what she is!" followed by the sharp, authoritative snap of Leonardo cutting him off. Clara collapsed against the cool, tiled wall of the service hallway, gasping for air. Her hands were shaking violently. When Chef Gabriel found her 10 minutes later, he didn't scream. He just took one look at her pale, terrified face, shoved a glass of cooking sherry into her hands, and told her to stay in the supply closet until the shift was over. But Clara knew she couldn't stay. The Morabito name was out. The wolves had caught the scent. By 1:30 a.m., L'Eclipse was dark. The Rossi family had departed just after midnight, leaving behind a completely untouched main course, a terrified waitstaff, and a $30,000 tip paid in crisp, sequential $100 bills. Clara had waited in the supply closet, sitting on a bucket of industrial floor cleaner, until she heard the head busboy lock the front doors. She stripped off her apron, grabbed her worn canvas tote bag, and slipped out the back service exit into the biting November cold. It was raining, a freezing, miserable New York drizzle that slickened the cobblestones of the Tribeca alleyway. Clara pulled her thin wool coat tight against her chest, her mind racing. She needed to pack her apartment. She needed to empty her meager savings account. She needed to disappear. She made it exactly 10 steps down the alley before a pair of blinding headlights flicked on, illuminating the rain-slicked brick walls. A massive black armored SUV was blocking the exit to the street. The engine idled with a deep, menacing purr. Clara froze, her breath pluming in the cold air. She turned to run back towards the restaurant, but a massive figure stepped out from the shadows near the dumpsters. It was Silvio, the heavily scarred capo from the dinner table. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stood there, a mountain of meat and muscle, effectively trapping her. The rear door of the SUV opened, and an umbrella bloomed in the dark. Leonardo Rossi stepped out into the rain. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored black dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and faint, creeping tattoos that peeked out from beneath his cuffs. He walked slowly toward Clara, the umbrella shielding him from the freezing drizzle, though he didn't offer any cover to her. "I told you not to leave the building until I said so," Leonardo murmured. His voice carried effortlessly over the sound of the rain. "My shift was over," Clara said, her teeth chattering, partly from the freezing rain soaking through her coat and partly from sheer terror. "You can't hold me here! I'll scream!" Leonardo actually smiled. It was a small, cruel thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Scream, Clara Russo. Scream as loud as you want. The police precinct is 3 blocks away. I fund their retirement pensions. The beat cops on this street drink my liquor. Who do you think is going to come to your rescue?" He closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. He tilted the umbrella slightly, casting them both in shadows. "My father hasn't eaten," Leonardo said. His tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "He hasn't spoken a word since you left the room. My capos are nervous. A multi-million-dollar negotiation stalled because an old man was spooked by a minimum-wage waitress." Leonardo leaned in, his face so close Clara could feel the warmth of his breath. "So, I ran a background check on a Clara Russo from Queens while my father was yelling at the wall. You don't exist, Clara. Your social security number belongs to a deceased woman from Ohio. Your address is a sublet, paid in cash. You are a ghost." "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara whispered, stepping back until her spine hit the wet brick wall of the alley. Leonardo stepped forward, pinning her with his gaze. He reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair from her cheek. The gesture was shockingly gentle, entirely at odds with the terrifying danger he represented. "My father called you a morabito," Leonardo continued softly. "For 20 years, I was told the morabito bloodline was extinguished. I was told my father personally ordered the hit on the last ruling Don of Castellamare in 1989. Caterina Morabito and her infant son supposedly died in a car fire outside Palermo." Clara's breath hitched. Tears mixed with the rain on her face. "Nonna. But you didn't die, did you?" Leonardo's eyes darkened, a terrifying realization dawning in them. The infant son survived. He came to America. He had a daughter, and he raised her with the old tongue. "My father was a baker," Clara suddenly cried out, the dam breaking. "He was a baker in Queens. He died of a heart attack when I was 10. We had nothing to do with your family, nothing to do with your wars. My grandmother just wanted us to be safe." Leonardo stared at her, absorbing her outburst. The cold calculation in his eyes shifted into something entirely different. It was hunger. It was the realization of ultimate leverage. "If my father finds out you are a true morabito, he will kill you," Leonardo stated plainly. "The old laws demand it. A blood feud doesn't end until the line is erased, and my father is a slave to the old laws." Clara slumped against the wall, the fight draining out of her. "Then why did you stop him in the restaurant? Why are you out here? Just let Silvio shoot me and get it over with." Leonardo laughed, a low, genuine sound that sent shivers down Clara's spine. He reached out, his warm, strong hand gripping her cold fingers. "Because, little ghost," Leonardo whispered, pulling her slightly away from the wall. "My father is a relic. He wants to rule by erasing the past. I want to rule by controlling the future. The Morabito name still commands the loyalty of half the old guard families in Sicily. Families who refuse to do business with me because they think my father is an honorless butcher." Leonardo's grip tightened on her hand. "You are not going back to Queens, Clara. You are coming with me. If you run, my father's men will find you and gut you. If you stay with me, I will protect you. But in exchange, you are going to help me take the Rossi Empire from my father. Starting tonight." The black armored SUV didn't take Clara back to her cramped, leaky apartment in Queens. Instead, it glided silently through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, pulling into the subterranean garage of a hyper-modern, glass and steel high-rise overlooking Central Park. For the next 3 weeks, Clara became a prisoner in a $50 million penthouse. It was a gilded cage of staggering opulence. The floors were imported Calcutta marble, the walls adorned with original modern art, and the panoramic windows offered a god's-eye view of the city that had, until recently, treated her like dirt. Her cheap waitressing uniform was burned the first night. In its place, silent stylists arrived, filling a walk-in closet with silk dresses, cashmere sweaters, and tailored coats. Leonardo Rossi was a phantom in his own home. He would leave before dawn, embroiled in a vicious, silent turf war with his own father, and return long after midnight, smelling of scotch, rain, and occasionally copper and gunpowder. But when he was there, the air crackled with a dangerous, unspoken tension. One evening in late November, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within, Leonardo found Clara standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. She was wearing a simple black silk dress, her dark hair falling in soft waves down her back. The timid, shaking waitress from L'Eclipse was gone, replaced by a woman who was slowly remembering the steel in her blood. "My father's men tore your apartment in Queens apart yesterday," Leonardo said, his voice slicing through the quiet hum of the penthouse. He walked to the crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. "They found nothing. He is tearing the city apart looking for you. He knows I have you, Clara. He just can't prove it yet." Clara didn't flinch. She turned to face him, accepting the heavy crystal glass he offered. "And what happens when he stops looking for proof and just kicks your door down, Leonardo?" "He won't," Leonardo smirked, taking a slow sip, "because he needs the old guard families in Sicily to approve his new port expansion in Brooklyn, men like Don Lucchese and old man Falcone. They are purists. They despise my father for the blood he spilled in the 80s, specifically the Morabito blood. If they find out you are alive, my father's empire crumbles overnight. He is terrified of you." "I have no power," Clara said, gripping her glass. "I have a name. That's it. A name doesn't stop bullets." Leonardo stepped closer, the ice blue of his eyes burning with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch. "A name is a key, Clara. But I need the lock. Before your grandmother fled Castellamare, she didn't just take you and your father. The rumors say she took the Morabito ledger, a book containing the original blood oaths, the debts owed to your family, and the proof of my father's treason against the High Council. Tell me where it is." Clara's heart pounded. She remembered the small, rusted safety deposit box key her grandmother had given her on her deathbed, pressing it into her palm with a feverish intensity. "Only when the wolves come to the door, Picurida. Only then." "There is a bank," Clara whispered, realizing she had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back to pouring wine. The old Bowery Savings Bank, down on the Lower East Side. The vault was grandfathered into a private security firm in the 90s. Account 814, under the name Caterina Russo. Leonardo's face transformed. The cold, calculating air vanished, replaced by a man looking at a woman who had just handed him the world. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing her jawline. The touch was electric, blurring the line between captor, protector, and something entirely more dangerous. "You are spectacular," he breathed, leaning in so close their lips almost brushed. "Tomorrow, we retrieve the ledger. And tomorrow night, we end my father's reign." The air inside the Bowery Savings Bank tasted like copper and old dust. It was an architectural relic from the 1920s, a cathedral of finance hidden in the gritty underbelly of the Lower East Side. Leonardo Rossi had the entire building cleared out by 9 a.m. No customers, no tellers, just a terrified, sweating branch manager named Arthur Sterling, who was practically vibrating with fear as he led Leonardo and Clara down the spiraling marble staircase towards the subterranean vaults. Clara walked a step behind Leonardo. She wore a sharp, tailored black trench coat over a high-necked crimson silk blouse, clothing paid for by the man who was currently holding her hand. His grip was firm, grounding her. Her heart was beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. In her left coat pocket, her fingers traced the jagged edges of a rusted brass key her grandmother, Katerina, had given her a decade ago. "Box 814, Leonardo said, his voice echoing off the cold steel of the vault room. It wasn't a request. It was an eviction notice. Arthur Sterling nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he inserted the master key into the heavy, brushed steel door of the lockbox. "Of course, Mr. Rossi. Right away. The grandfathered accounts haven't been touched since the late 90s. I didn't even know anyone was still paying the retainer." "Someone wasn't," Leonardo replied coldly. "Now give us the room." Sterling didn't need to be told twice. He scurried back up the marble stairs, leaving Clara and Leonardo alone in the suffocating silence of the vault. Clara stepped forward. Her hand trembled as she pulled the rusted brass key from her pocket. She slid it into the secondary lock. It fit perfectly. With a heavy metallic clack, the lock disengaged. Leonardo reached out and pulled the long metal drawer free, setting it on the inspection table in the center of the room. Inside lay a single, heavy object, wrapped in faded, moth-eaten red velvet. It smelled of dried lavender and ancient, dried blood. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She carefully pulled back the velvet to reveal a thick, leather-bound ledger. The leather was cracked and scarred, the edges of the thick parchment pages yellowed with time. Resting on top of the book was a single, folded piece of stationery. Clara picked up the letter. Her grandmother's elegant, sweeping cursive was instantly recognizable. "Per la mia piccola Clara, quando I lupi busseranno, non scappare. Mostra loro I denti. For my little Clara, when the wolves knock, do not run. Show them your teeth." Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. For her entire life, she had believed her grandmother was a coward who had fled Sicily in the dead of night to scrub floors in Queens. She had believed they were nobodies. But as she opened the heavy cover of the ledger, the truth stared back at her in faded black ink. The pages were filled with columns of names, dates, and amounts. But it wasn't a financial ledger. It was a record of blood. It documented the oaths sworn to the Morabito family by the capos of Castellammare del Golfo. And in the center of the book, dated October 14th, 1989, was the damning evidence, a detailed log written by the former Don of the Lucchese family, outlining exactly how much Salvatore Rossi had paid a crew of rogue hitmen to slaughter the Morabito High Council while they slept. It was absolute, irrefutable proof of Salvatore's treason against the sacred Omerta. "He didn't just kill them," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as her fingers traced the dried, brown stains on the paper. "He bought them. He paid for the slaughter with stolen union money, and he blamed it on a rival faction." Leonardo stepped up behind her. He didn't touch the book. He knew better. That book was a holy relic to the men they were about to face. Instead, he placed his hands on Clara's shoulders, his thumbs gently brushing the tense muscles at the base of her neck. "My father built a kingdom on a lie," Leonardo murmured, his breath warming her ear. "And today, the ghost of Castellammare is going to burn his kingdom to the ground. Are you ready, Clara?" Clara closed the ledger. The timid, invisible waitress from L'Eclipse had died in that vault. The woman who turned around to face Leonardo had eyes as dark and hard as obsidian. "I am ready," she said. The drive to Staten Island took exactly 45 minutes. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the armored Mercedes Maybach. The neutral ground chosen by the Sicilian Council was a sprawling, fortified estate surrounded by 10-foot-high wrought iron fences and guarded by men carrying suppressed automatic weapons. As the car pulled through the gates, Leonardo took Clara's hand. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his pale blue eyes stripping away all pretense. "The men inside that room are dinosaurs. They are brutal, unforgiving, and they do not care about modern laws. Don Lucchese and Don Falcone flew in from Palermo specifically for this. They think they are here to mediate a dispute between my father and me over territory. When you walk in, you cannot hesitate. If they smell fear on you, they will let my father shoot you just to avoid the paperwork. Do you understand?" "I don't plan on hesitating," Clara replied, her grip tightening on the velvet-wrapped ledger resting in her lap. The car stopped. The doors opened. The estate's grand ballroom had been converted into a tribunal. Heavy blackout curtains were drawn over the windows, and the air was thick with the suffocating haze of Cohiba cigars and stale espresso. At the far end of the room sat a massive, polished mahogany table. Don Salvatore Rossi sat at the head, looking like a cornered lion. His silver-tipped cane rested against his chair, and 30 heavily armed loyalists, including the scarred capo, Silvio, stood shoulder to shoulder behind him. Flanking the table were the 5 elders of the Sicilian Old Guard. Don Lucchesi, a frail man in his 80s, with eyes like a hawk, sat quietly, sipping a glass of mineral water. Don Falcone, a massive man with a thick white beard, looked openly bored. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a deafening boom. The room fell dead silent. Every head snapped towards the entrance. Leonardo walked in first, radiating a terrifying, ice-cold authority. He didn't wear a tie, his collar open, looking completely unbothered by the 50 guns currently hidden under the jackets of the men in the room. But it was the woman walking beside him that caused the temperature in the room to plummet. Clara stepped into the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. In her crimson silk blouse and sharp black coat, she looked like a drop of fresh blood on a white canvas. She walked with a terrifying grace, her chin held high, her dark eyes locked dead onto Don Salvatore. Salvatore's jaw slackened. The cigar slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the Persian rug. The color drained completely from his weathered face. He looked as if a corpse had just crawled out of a grave in Queens and marched into his stronghold. "You," Salvatore breathed, his voice a ragged whisper that quickly escalated into a frantic roar. "You dare bring this American putana into a council meeting? Are you insane, Leonardo? Silvio, shoot her! Shoot her right now!" Silvio's hand snapped to the holster under his arm, his weapon clearing the leather. Before he could raise the barrel, Leonardo's voice cracked like a whip. "Draw that weapon, Silvio, and I will personally mail your hands to your wife." Silvio froze. The tension in the room snapped taut. The bodyguards loyal to the Sicilian elders immediately drew their own weapons, aiming them squarely at Salvatore's men. The metallic clicks of safeties being disengaged echoed like a firing squad, preparing to execute. "Enough!" Don Lucchesi barked. The frail old man slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. Surprisingly, the sound commanded immediate obedience. The guns remained drawn, but the men stopped moving. Lucchesi adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and glared at Leonardo. "You disrespect this council, Leonardo. You bring a woman, a civilian, into a matter of blood?" "She is no civilian, Don Lucchesi," Leonardo said smoothly, stepping aside to give Clara the floor. "And she is not here as my guest. She is here to claim her seat." Clara stepped forward. The sheer weight of the stares from the most dangerous men in the world should have crushed her. A month ago, dropping a fork in front of these men would have sent her into a panic attack. But as she looked at Salvatore's terrified, sweating face, she felt absolutely nothing but a cold, righteous fury. She walked directly to the mahogany table and stopped right in front of Don Lucchesi. She didn't bow. She didn't lower her eyes. She placed the velvet-wrapped package onto the polished wood and pulled back the fabric. "Sabine Rica, Don Lucchesi," Clara's voice rang out, filling the cavernous ballroom. She spoke in the pure, ancient Trapanese dialect. It wasn't the broken Italian of an American descendant. It was the exact cadence, the exact intonation of the old country. "Mi chiamo Clara Morabito, figlia di Vincenzo, nipote di Caterina, porto il sangue di Castellammare e porto la prova del tradimento." "Blessings, Don Lucchesi. My name is Clara Morabito, daughter of Vincenzo, granddaughter of Caterina. I carry the blood of Castellamare, and I carry the proof of treason." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Don Falcone actually dropped his espresso cup. It shattered on the floor, but no one looked down. The name Morabito hit the room like a physical shockwave. Don Lucchese's eyes widened behind his glasses. He stared at Clara's face, tracing the slope of her nose, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. "Caterina's line?" he whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. "Salvatore swore the line was burned to ash in the 80s? "Salvatore Rossi is a liar, a butcher, and a traitor to the Omerta," Clara stated loudly, turning her gaze to the panicked Don at the head of the table. "He broke the sacred truce of 1989. He paid the Corsican mercenaries with union money to slaughter my grandfather and his brothers. He claimed the territory illegally, and I have the ledger to prove it." Clara pushed the heavy leather book across the table toward Lucchese. "Don't look at that book!" Salvatore screamed, panic fully consuming him. He tried to stand, but his bad leg gave out, and he collapsed heavily back into his chair. "It's a forgery! Leonardo made it to frame me. She's a waitress, a minimum-wage rat he picked up in a restaurant." Don Lucchese ignored him. His trembling, liver-spotted hands reached out and opened the heavy leather cover. Don Falcone leaned over his shoulder. The two elders stared at the pages. They recognized the handwriting of their deceased peers. They recognized the wax seals. They recognized the bloodstains. For 5 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the ballroom was the heavy breathing of armed men and the slow, deliberate turning of parchment pages. Finally, Don Lucchese closed the book. The heavy thud sounded like a judge's gavel. Lucchese slowly removed his glasses. He looked at Salvatore Rossi not with anger, but with the cold, detached disgust of a man looking at a diseased animal. "The ink is dry, Salvatore," Lucchese said quietly. The gravelly tone of his voice carried a finality that made the air turn to ice. "The signatures are authentic. You broke the truce. You spilled the blood of the High Council for greed, and you lied to us for 25 years. Lucchese, please," Salvatore begged, his arrogant facade completely shattering. Lucchese held up a single finger, silencing him. He turned his gaze to the 30 men standing behind Salvatore. "Any man who stands behind Salvatore Rossi is an enemy of the Sicilian Council. Any man who draws a weapon in his defense will have his entire family erased. Put your guns on the floor, now." It didn't take a minute. It took 10 seconds. Silvio was the first. The scarred capo looked at Salvatore, shook his head in disgust, and placed his heavy pistol onto the carpet. One by one, the loyalists defected. The clatter of 30 guns hitting the floor was the sound of a 40-year empire collapsing into dust. Salvatore was completely alone. He looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He looked at Clara, pure venom in his eyes. "You think you've won?" Salvatore hissed, gripping the edges of the table. "You're a girl playing in a world of wolves. They will tear you apart." "I am the wolf, Salvatore," Clara replied softly, stepping closer to him. She leaned down, planting her hands on the table, her face inches from his. "And you are just an old man who has run out of time." Leonardo stepped up beside Clara. He didn't gloat. He simply looked down at the man who had raised him, manipulated him, and tried to crush him. "The elders and I have reached an agreement, Papa," Leonardo said, his voice devoid of any familial warmth. "You are not going to die today. That would be too easy. There is a private jet waiting for you at Teterboro. You will be flown to a farmhouse in Corleone. There are no phones, no guards, no money. You will live out the rest of your days tending to goats, knowing that the Morabito name destroyed you." Salvatore opened his mouth to scream, to curse them both, but the fight had completely left him. He looked at the elders, but they had already turned their backs to him. He was a ghost. 2 of Lucchese's men grabbed Salvatore by the arms, dragging him out of the chair. He didn't struggle. He simply picked up his silver-tipped cane, his shoulders slumped, and walked out of the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the shadows of history. The room began to clear. The elders offered Clara respectful, deep nods as they passed, acknowledging the return of the Morabito bloodline. Lucchesi took the ledger, promising the territory would be redistributed fairly, and departed. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was empty, save for Clara and Leonardo. The silence was deafening. The adrenaline that had been keeping Clara upright suddenly vanished, and her knees buckled slightly. Leonardo was there instantly. His strong arms caught her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The smell of his cologne, bergamot and dark wood, enveloped her, grounding her. "You did it," Leonardo murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He buried his face in her hair, his hands gripping her tightly, as if afraid she might vanish back into the shadows. "You were magnificent. You took down the king." Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "We took him down," she corrected softly, looking up into his pale blue eyes. Leonardo's gaze dropped to her lips. The cold, calculated Mafia air was completely gone. In his place was a man entirely captivated by the woman who had just rewritten the rules of his world. He didn't hesitate. Leonardo cupped her face, his thumbs gently sweeping over her cheekbones, and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, fierce, and completely consuming, a silent promise of protection, of partnership, and of a dangerous, undeniable love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Leonardo rested his forehead against hers. A small, genuine smile played on his lips. "So," Leonardo whispered, his thumb tracing her lower lip, "what is your first order of business, Donna Morabito?" Clara smiled, the timid waitress from Queens officially laid to rest. She smoothed the lapels of his suit and looked at the empty throne at the head of the table. "First," Clara said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, brilliant light, "we are never eating Wagyu beef again." Clara's transformation from a terrified, minimum-wage waitress trying to blend into the background to the undisputed queen of the New York underworld is a testament to the fact that you can never truly outrun your blood. She thought her grandmother's old-world Sicilian dialect was a curse to be hidden, but in the end, those very words became her ultimate weapon. Alongside Leonardo Rossi, Clara didn't just survive the Mafia. She rewrote its rules, proving that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one pouring the wine.